Thanks, Alex, and welcome everybody to another session on the 2023 DOD Cloud Exchange. And as you've heard, this year we're going to try and cover a lot of what the department is doing from the enterprise all the way to the tactical edge. And this panel here is very much focused on that tactical end of the spectrum. We've got three great guests with us to talk from both the customer point of view and the capability developer point of view about the experimentation work the Army's been doing with tactical cloud, really all around the world, but I think including most recently in the Indo-Pacific. And that brings us to our first guest. Colonel Liz Casely is the CIO G6 for the Army First Corps. Pacific, of course, is the First Corps' AOR. Also with us from the technology development and acquisition side of the house are Colonel Matt Paul, the Army's project manager for Mission Command, and Colonel Shane Taylor, project manager for Tactical Networks, both, of course, under the umbrella of Army PEO C3T. Thanks very much to each of you for being here. I really appreciate it. And Colonel Casely, I think I'd like to start with you. I'm sure a lot of this question applies to the broader Army too, but I know your boss in particular, General Brunson, the First Corps commander, has been really focused on pivoting to this idea of distributed operations. I'm hoping you can get us started by talking a bit about what that means and how that gets you to the requirement for things like cloud-enabled IT services and data-centric ways of thinking about how you run communications across that really huge and complex AOR.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Hello, everyone. And I think I'll probably just start off with the First Corps' problem statement. So America's First Corps, which is the only Army-assigned 3-star operational headquarters under U.S. Army Pacific Command, must do two things. First, receive, integrate, and employ joint multinational forces during competition, crisis, conflict in the Indo-Pacific theater, where the U.S. forces are currently relying on very, very long exterior lines. The second thing is that we have to provide the Joint Force Commander options against the adversary who have parity or near parity with great distances, very harsh geographic conditions, and this challenges the Army's ability to operate across all domains and warfighting functions. So the approach, you mentioned Lieutenant General Brunson's approach to this, was to operationalize something we call distributed command and control. And the idea here was the development of an operational framework to solve the above problem that I just laid out. So we take into consideration the geography, the geometry, the adversary's capability, so deep magazine depth, interior lines, mass, and the available multi-domain technology. First Corps has an absolute requirement to operate in the region differently, to think and act differently and perform differently. And given the fact that First Corps is actually located at Joint Base Lewis McChord, just traversing the Indo-Pacific to get into theater where it can be effective and start providing the Joint Force Commander options against adversaries is also a challenge. So what we discovered is that distribution at the Corps level is a necessary condition for operations. The Corps won't be dispersed, but it'll be deliberately placed in time and space and task organized and purpose-built by mission and available resources. And that includes network resources. The idea here is to make us, number one, survivable, and then agile, resilient, and scalable in order to contribute to the joint warfight. And I'll stop there and see if you have any questions on the why.
Yeah. Right. So say a bit more about how everything you just said in terms of operational concepts connects to your IT requirements. How does that change how what you need from the network and from IT services more generally going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this presents a huge problem for us to employ the network as it's designed to function with the doctrinal SITTEMP of a core, main, TAC, and rear. There are a couple of different things, and I'll break them down into 4 bins because that's, I think, an easier way to approach it. So start with a wide area network. So we need a global WAN architecture that is not regionally aligned, so it's regionally agnostic and globally available. So the idea that First Corps would come into the Pacific, operate as a FLIC, a JFLIC, a CJFLIC, part of a JTF, in order to provide options for the Joint Force Commander requires us to be able to access joint and partner resources wherever they might reside globally. Just because we are fighting inside the Indo-Pacific theater does not necessarily mean that the resources that we require in order to inform the flight, operate against contested logistics, close the kill chain in conjunction with partners and allies region. The ability for us to have a transport network that allows us to distribute data. That's the heart and soul of moving data around, right? What we do with that data, how we organize it, et cetera, actually requires a transport network to deliver it to the right place so that you can make a decision and then implement execution of that decision. That's incredibly important. The second thing I would say is that we would like to be able to, so this is centered around collaboration and mission command information systems, but it really is the services and the collaboration architecture that's required in order for this distribution to be effective. So the distribution of our mission command service infrastructure, one, which starts to uncouple hardware and software and starts to uncouple this very tightly nested servant client infrastructure that we're largely used to using proximity in order to reduce the amount of latency, right? So the server and client can talk to each other. That's a challenge in the Pacific, because when we're talking about distributing, we're not talking about just a few hundred meters away. We're talking thousands of miles, different land masses, oceans. And so again, that goes back to having a fantastic global architecture network, global WAN architecture that allows us to distribute in this way. But secondly, what we've discovered is that we don't have enough people, technicians, or server client architecture to go around that will actually help us employ in this way. And so this idea leads us to employing tactical cloud or just cloud architectures that are multi-hybrid cloud environments. So multi meaning multiple cloud vendors, public-private clouds, could be internal cloud to First Core. It could be public cloud environments that are set up by cloud service providers. Multi is that first part of it. The second piece of it would be hybrid. And this is incredibly important because this allows us to be able to connect into this environment with on-prem architecture. And the idea here is that it mitigates against DDIL environments. So this, so the mitigation of this DDIL environment comes with, again, task organizing, purpose building by mission and available resources, what you need to have on premise with you if at some point in time you are disconnected from your transport network. The third area that we like to bend this into is the data. So this is really what resides in the information environment. And we are in the middle of a heavy lift towards moving towards a data-centric organization. And I'll always say that it requires three things to come together all at the same time in order for that to be capable. So it's talent, it's the tools to do it, and then it's exposing the data, which is a heavy data engineering lift that needs to occur, moving things from flat files, PowerPoint, unstructured data into a structured environment. That way it's visible, queryable, accessible, you name it. And then the two things that I listed above, which is a persistent information environment that's multi and hybrid cloud environment, as well as the global network, will allow us access to that data. First Core is in the process of moving through that, and then I can explain that a little bit later in depth where we are on that in terms of talent, tools, and then beginning to expose the data, identifying use cases, connecting with the operational problem. All those three things, though, are largely academic unless we're tightly nested with the question that the warfighter is trying to solve. And so that's where this comes together underneath General Brunson's leadership, because he has stated that data is commander's business. It's his business, and it's an operational commodity. It's ammunition that's has to be used, and it has to be governed in a way that is coupled with the mission and the operation. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about our approach towards security. So a zero trust environment. We are just in the very nascent stages of understanding the technology, taking a look at the multiple networks that we have, the enclaves that we operate on, understanding where we can start to experiment and organize ourselves differently, and actually just put in a couple of different process things to mitigate how we do business today, which causes us to have multiple different identities accessing multiple different networks, and start to move towards one of the first pillars of zero trust, which is identity. And all of that needs to be controlled by some sort of network operational cell. And at the heart and soul of this is delivering the commander or the warfighter what he needs, which is mission assurance. Right? How does the network deliver mission assurance in order to allow the commander to make decisions on where he should be in time and space and how he should operate?
Those four bins, I think, are a great way to tee up the rest of the discussion we're going to have today. And as I come to you next, Colonel Taylor and Colonel Paul, I guess I'll tee it up to you this way, which is all the things that Colonel Casely just talked about as the problem set in the Pacific Corps. How much of that is universal as you look across the broader Army and the things that you're being asked to develop? You know, General Ray with the network cross-functional team talks a lot about how the Army writ large is not going to take the network with you everywhere you go, wherever there's a fight. How much of everything that Colonel Casely just said are kind of universal Army requirements, even though I'm sure there's a lot of uniqueness in the Pacific?
Yeah, so I can take on from the transport perspective, and then I'll pass it over to Colonel Paul. One, absolutely, completely agree. It is more of a universal issue. I think it's probably exacerbated with what I-Corps has to deal with from a geography perspective. And we talk distributed ops. They're definitely probably the theater that experiences that the most. But from a transport perspective, Colonel Casely touched on things like D-Deal and the increased demand from a transport perspective as you go to things like cloud. So our focus area within TN has been on providing that assured transport. And so I'll talk three things from a near-term perspective of what we mean by that. So first of all, as we move forward in assured transport, we talk about waveforms. We have to make sure that as we mature those waveforms that we're keeping in mind, things like AJ or anti-jam capabilities, LPI, LPD, areas like that. So that's one area where we're helping to ensure that assured transport. Secondly, another way we define resiliency is through multipath. If you were in an environment a few years ago, you had, probably your biggest option from a SATCOM perspective was a geo orbit through WGS. What we want to do in the future is we're probably never going to get ourselves truly out of a D-Deal environment. There's always ability to jam. There's always ability to cut fiber. There's always geography and terrain features that get in the way of line of sight capabilities. But our goal really is to provide as many transport paths, as many links as possible to mitigate the D-Deal environment. So specific to that, we're working on efforts to add to the S6's toolkit, give them as many paths as possible. And so that means, line of sight, it means beyond line of sight, especially in the PACOM theater, things like troposphere, things like that if you're in a SATCOM denied environment, you can still be able to get a signal out from a beyond line of sight perspective, especially as you go island to island. Things like host nation fiber, host nation cell, and then SATCOM. And then within SATCOM, we want to expand the options than what we have today, right? So I think we learned some lessons last year in UCOM from some capacity challenges that we have on just the MILSAT side. And so there's definitely an opportunity to bring in more capacity there. And we'll do that through things like multi-orbit. Today, again, heavy geo, but there's a lot of commercial work being done in the LEO space and in the MEO space as well. And then all of that, as well as other bands. So all of that is underpinned by the ability to, can we do that at the edge while keeping it simple for the user at the edge, right? So everything I just said comes with complexity. So our goal is to ensure that we're creating applications or processes that enable soldiers at the edge to be able to leverage all those links that we just talked about, but do so seamlessly and simplicity, and able to do it from a simple implementation standpoint. The third effort I'll talk about is some work that we're doing on the S&T side, quite a bit of work in what we'll call auto pace or software that will pick best path, depending on how we QoS it. There's also the ability to cross-load moving data across multi-paths. All of that done with software that's automated so that from an end user to person, it's all agnostic to them. It's agnostic transport. It picks the best path. It can cross-load. And so we try to mitigate if one link goes down, it automatically moves to another. And the unit is able to establish an automated pace plan from that perspective. And so I think those are kind of the three big transport focus areas that we're on right now. And I think they're kind of critical from a transport perspective to what Oipol is doing, but I also think they're probably more universally needed as we move towards more distributed ops in the future from an Army formation perspective.
Before we go to Colonel Paul, I want to do just one more beat on the transport agnostic piece of this, because it seems so central to me. I mean, you mentioned you're going to use SATCOM, you're going to use potentially host nation fiber, host nation cell networks. I mean, really, is there anything that's off the table in terms of what types of transport you would use for this while you're trying to stitch it all together into something that looks like one network?
Yeah, so we want to be able to give the commanders on the ground and their sixes as many options as possible. So we're part of our opportunity here is as commercial capabilities become more available, right? I think again that's part of the biggest change that we've seen over the last couple of years is commercially available capabilities are more and more a part of our toolkit today. We came from almost everything being an effort that was developed organically within the military, within DOD that we took forward with us. Now the rapid abundance of capabilities from especially in a commercial SATCOM market has made other options available. So I would say none of those options are off the table. We do have to keep in mind, the more we give, the more complexity we add. So there's that to keep in mind. I will say, if it's available to us, it's available to others. And so one of our competitive advantages in this space is the ability to leverage those commercial capabilities, but more importantly, to rapidly integrate and rapidly train them. And then as new things come available, we're able to to take advantage of that as well. So we're constantly working with our S&T partners on the next gen available capabilities just within line of sight. We've got spectrum challenges on that side. And limitations associated with that. So there's other things that are coming, available like free space optics and others. Millimeter wave are some new technologies that are out there. So we want to be able to leverage all of the above, but it's important and paramount that we do so with keeping simplicity in mind, right? So we can give soldiers all the capability and capacity available, but if we do so in a very complex environment, it takes them away from what they should be focused on. And we don't need them spending all their time fighting the network as opposed to what they should be focused on. So paramount to every capability we provide is, can we do so in a simple and intuitive capability? And so I think that's where things like auto pace, anything that we can script, anything that we can automate is paramount to being able to achieve that capability.
Colonel Paul, definitely want to get you in here. Sorry it's so late here. Please talk about anything that your colleagues have spoken about so far, but maybe start with some of the data challenges that Colonel Casely talked to us about, that the challenges involved in exposing the data in a sensible architecture and exposing the right data at the point of need.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so I'll certainly build off of Colonel Taylor's comments as well as Colonel Casely. And I think to answer your previous question, I think a lot of the challenges are universal. I agree with Colonel Taylor. I tend to think of environments that we deploy capability as either most likely or most stressing. I definitely believe that Colonel Casely's fight in the Indo-Pacific theater would be characterized as most stressing via the tyranny of distance, working with all of the joint partners, an array of coalition partners, trying to stitch all that together to achieve a desired effect is going to be quite difficult in that space. And so taking lessons learned from Colonel Casely and all of the trainings that they've conducted over the past year has caused our organization to sort of reevaluate our assumptions about how we deploy capability in terms of how much capability does a corps get, what types of capability. To be frank, I don't think we're quite optimized yet for distributed command and control. And so Colonel Casely talked a little bit about that, where her corps is going to be distributed across various island chains doing specific things, how does that change how much capability we deliver and what type of capability we deliver? So we're kind of doing that analysis now, and we're providing recommendations back to Army Futures Command as well as the Army staff. So I'm as the data proponent here. My view is it's all about the data. Transport is critical, but at the end of the day, it's really all about the data. Colonel Casely and her staff and her commander need to have persistent access to data, and they need a way to synchronize it that is easy. We talked about complexity, and in a way that is truly seamless, adopting commercial best practices. And so that is what I'm focused on right now. And my office, PM Mission Command, we're working with Colonel Casely's team as well as her higher headquarters at USAPAC as that theater Army headquarters as part of the Army Data Plan campaign of learning. So about a year-long process to iterate new capability, new data-intensive capability, new technologies, new concepts of operation with USAPAC and with all of its subordinate organizations to provide that persistent data access and that data synchronization that's so critical in that theater of operations. So our work kind of started back at Project Convergence 22. We deployed some initial minimum viable products, if you will. We got some reps and sets with USAPAC headquarters and other formations participating in the exercise. We learned a lot, and what we're doing now is we're taking those lessons and we're applying them towards the Army Data Plan campaign of learning. So a series of exercises that are going to be joint and multinational over the next several months. And the idea is that we're getting better as we go along. We're going to get continuous feedback from the users on what we're providing. So the two big gaps that we're closing, again, data access, data synchronization. So persistent access to authoritative data sources and making that data available to the users at the edge. And then also the synchronizing the data under MDO-like conditions. So we mentioned DDIL earlier. So you're in a contested or congested environment and you lose your connection, or maybe it's just disrupted. Being able to access data and synchronize data while on the move or at the quick halt, that is what we're trying to optimize right now through the technologies that we have. We're partnered with Army Cyber Command, who is the Army's kind of foremost experts on data. And they have a lot of technologies that we're bringing into our space in the command and control space. And we are enhancing those capabilities for USAPAC and for the Army Data Plan to see, okay, what works in USAPAC and is it scalable to other combatant commands? Is it scalable to the total Army? So that's what we hope to get out of the next year with all of the work that we're doing. The three big questions that you mentioned, or Colonel Casely mentioned, data needs to answer questions. So what we're trying to answer for USAPAC headquarters initially are, how far can I fight? How long can I fight for? And what can I accomplish with the resources that I have? And so those are three very big questions that's going to require a lot of data and a lot of data preparation to help answer for the commander and his staff. So that's sort of the big task that lies ahead of us.
Colonel Casely, let me come back to you, and I'd like you to talk in a little more specific detail on the cloud experimentation that's actually been happening in the Pacific. Tell me a bit about the specific projects that you've been working on, the specific pilots, and anything that you've learned from those so far.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about all the things that First Corps is doing to enable distributed command and control. I'll start first with the current exercise that we have ongoing right now. We're experimenting with our multi-hybrid cloud environment. And so in support of Cobra Gold, where First Corps is acting as a joint task force in Thailand, we have a multi-node configuration where we have some at home station at Joint Base Lewis McChord, and then multiple nodes forward. This does not just stop at the core headquarters, but extends down to the divisions too as well. So I'll start with the multiple cloud presence. So we have normally our private cloud presence that we typically stand up at JBLM. That includes some of our mission command information structure. This is something that most corps do in order to be able to tap into some of the air control pieces of our warfighting mission command systems that are necessary. We're also leveraging, working with a specific vendor that has actually moved to making their mission command application for fires cloud native. And that is being deployed in some on-prem architecture in different organizations. So it'll go into the division, it'll go into the core headquarters, and it'll go into the fires brigade too as well. But that is just limited in terms of how many mission command applications are inside of that on-premise architecture. Secondly, we're also working very closely with PM Mission Command to modernize as a bridge towards microservices, use infrastructure as code to modernize some of our mission command information systems. We're specifically focused on the one that ties it all together, so command post computing environment, and the ability to put that in either a hyperscale or on-prem architecture, and then connect that with other cloud service providers to include our private cloud. And then lastly, the expectation is that all of the folks that are participating in this exercise will come with their normal server infrastructure, so our TSI servers, and connect into that environment. Limited technical insertion at this point, and we hope to get towards a validation phase of it, and hope to have some things in writing on all the lessons that we've learned that we'll work together with our partners at PM Mission Command, and then provide back to the greater Army enterprise. So we're incredibly excited about this opportunity to see how we connect these multiple cloud environments and then work towards tying together our mission command infrastructure in a distributed configuration that is largely thousands of miles apart. The second thing that we're working on with our partners at PMTN, Tactical Networks, is they are providing cloud offerings at points of presence that are closer to us in the Pacific. The challenge for us with the great distances on a global WAN architecture, especially in the Pacific, transport is one of our #1 challenges, is having to make decisions between latency and bandwidth. So latency is a huge challenge for us, especially if you have to ride your network architecture back to a certain point in order to connect to certain information environments. And so those are some of the things that we're looking towards seeing more technical insertions, and then using our exercises to validate the architecture, and then providing lessons learned back to the forward. And lastly, I'll talk about what we're doing with our data warfare team. So First Corps, under General Brunson's guidance, as his #1 priority, is to stand up a data warfare team. The idea here is to now start to move towards machine to machine, or potentially machine with limited human enabling decision-making speed. We're doing an internal, so we start first with a phase one. Phase one included a data readiness level assessment. We sort of already knew that where we were towards some digital, but mostly analog processes. And we captured that during our warfighter back in September. The second phase now is to do an internal call for talent. Take a look at some of the talent that is resident within First Corps that could potentially be a part of this team. Get those folks trained. So we have a training pipeline that we're developing. Develop the metrics by which we're assessing, and then continuing to refine the team. And then also develop our user stories. So we have some user stories, or epics, folks call them, along the logistics line of effort, and then also in a, I would say, probably closing the kill chain line of effort, but really heavily focused on assessments and how we do our assessments process inside the Corps to inform intel collection that goes very quickly inside of a targeting working group to inform targeting and fires for future operations in a more dynamic machine-to-machine way, as opposed to this very static legacy analog way that we've been doing business that requires a lot of staff hours and manual labor. So we've taken those and we're going to take probably the logistics line of effort and make that engineering ready. So we've got that user case defined. We're working hand in hand in a partnership with our domain owner, which is inside of the G4, the first core G4, unpacking very specifically the data transformations that need to happen, what data we want to see where. We've also aligned that with U.S.A, so U.S. Army Pacific, who is also building out a log COP, and they're not necessarily at the theater army level data generators. They require those data generators to push that information up. And then we'll hope to test that out in further detail as we move into exercises in the Pacific and Australia later this summer. And so that's largely where the core is. Internal to the core, as we are thinking about ways to connect to our cloud environment, making different decisions on what type of transport we use, setting up multiple paths so that we can use bandwidth virtualization and other items that are coming out of the PMs that they're providing to us to test. We're also unpacking how we do business differently and talking about how a data warfare team and moving towards machine-to-machine decision-making, which is a long ways off, right? We have a huge data engineering lift to get through first, can help us potentially reorganize the core and also change how we do business in the core. So that's a process and organization piece that Lieutenant General Brunson says that he is responsible for. He understands that solution, kit, and technology will be delivered, but in order to employ it and do what I would call innovation, which is the delivery of a capability to impact, he believes that he's responsible for the very difficult part, which is the organization and the process piece of this. So I'll stop there, see if you have any other questions.
I do want to do one quick follow-up. There's a lot there that we can't follow up on everything you just said, but let me pick just one, which is some of the LOEs that you mentioned around that involve moving from analog to digital processes. For people who have not been in these formations, which is most of us, can you spend a minute maybe giving us an example or two of some of those processes that you are working to automate? What does that look like in the real world?
Yeah, certainly. So if you think about, I'll take the kill chain because I think that's probably a little easier to talk about. If you take your intelligence collection process that occurs, right? There's multiple sources from which you're drawing data in order to align your intel collection piece, which really informs operations and moves into what we would call a targeting sort of working group to sort of talk about, hey, what things are we collecting intelligence on? And where might we find targets? That goes into a decision board. You'll go into a fires process. And then from there, you'll have to do some sort of analysis of battle damage. And then that goes largely into an assessment. So think about all these different processes that are occurring in intelligence, which has its own stovepipe data sources that kind of come together in one sort of structure. Then you're moving this into a decision space to talk about what things you might target. When you move that from targeting and you move it into fires, I think there's a fairly tightly coupled structure there, but it does require data to be structured in a way that allows the machines to understand it. But then when you move that back into battle damage assessment and then an assessment working group, which is, okay, what things did we target? Did we hit them? So, did we perform the task we asked ourselves that we wanted to perform? And then what are the measures of effectiveness aligned against our mission? Some of these processes are occurring inside of folks' brains. There's sort of an algorithm that's happening inside of your brain, and then you're trying to display it in a two-dimensional way on a flat file on a piece of paper. It requires a voice over for folks to understand, here's what we collected on, here's what we targeted, here's what we fired, here's how well we accomplished our firing mission, and then here's the assessment on what we should do next. That requires multiple staff sections to come together that are now distributed across the Pacific. You need collaboration tools in order for you to exchange information on what's happening inside your brain. There are structures where you can actually, there is technology available to build a data structure that actually allows that process to occur faster without all this manual staff processing and putting it into a way to display it. Largely, we have the tools right now inside of First Corps to display decisions or display outcomes or display information in a way that says, oh, aha, I see that. Here is another opportunity. So now what you're following is this very linear sort of logical path Whereas commanders can actually come in, look at something that is driven by like readily present on-time data and say, hey, I want to make a different decision at this time, and I want to make it sooner than I would normally make it. If you don't have that machine-to-machine connection to inform that sort of fast and quick dynamic sort of cycle, then you're largely left to how long does it take for me to translate this onto a PowerPoint or a PDF slide or into a Word document or send it in a chat for someone to understand what I'm talking about, make a decision for us to collaborate, and then get it into the normal process that you use. And that is what we're seeing. We're seeing how slow that is. We can't react to things that are happening dynamically as fast as we would like. We also are allowing what we call data to drop on the floor because information is coming in, and then we don't have a process or a tool or the talent to pull that data into a structured environment and then display it to say, hey, new information has come in that potentially changes the decision that you just made hours ago.
And Colonel Taylor, it's great examples, by the way. And Colonel Taylor, let me come to you next. What Colonel Casely just talked about there in terms of all the work involved in reducing the cognitive load on folks and automating things. I think you're doing a lot of that on the network itself too, right? In terms of trying to simplify the network so that Colonel Casely's S6s out there in the formations aren't spending as much time as they are now with manual processes and loading CDs into machines, and because they're going to have additional workloads coming up here trying to integrate all the new transport options you're giving them, right? So the work's got to come off their plate in some other ways, I would imagine.
No, I 100% agree, and also agree. Great examples, by the way, by Colonel Casely. So 100% agree that as we add this capability, we absolutely have to keep in mind, how do we reduce the burden off the soldiers at the edge, right? We need it to be as simple and as intuitive as possible. So there's a lot of efforts underway. You heard Colonel Casely talk about bandwidth virtualization. That's one of those capabilities. That's an auto pacing capability that we're talking about. But there's other things that we can do too, from things as simple as when we do loads, right? Can those be done over the air? In the past, you would send disk. Those disks would get to a unit, and at some point in the future, that unit would have to, bring the systems down, reload all the software as we were putting new patches on the systems to ensure that they were remaining compliant with some of our cyber challenges. Those things take time. Things like, and so we can automate those processes now. We can also, as we move forward, our goal is to be able to do those over the air. So the unit at whatever time they can do an ASI or they can do a service interruption, that they can go ahead and do that load right there. So that's another effort. Another thing that we're doing in the future as we move forward is an effort called Unified Network Operations that's being run out of one of our other PMs here within PEOC3T. That is a fundamental change in how we are going to net ops everything that we just talked about, right? The ability to install, operate, and maintain all these disparate systems today is done fairly independently by each of those systems. They each come with some of their own network software solutions as far as how you maintain them. UNO is meant to get after the ability to net ops the entire fleet from a single point of presence. And so I think that we're in the infancy of that effort, but that's one of the more significant efforts underway as far as simplifying, managing the network. As part of that, there's also an intent to move at what echelon we manage the network as well. So the more complex capabilities that are required to be managed, we want to bring those up out of the edge, bring them up to divisions or even higher, and have that effort maintained there to where, again, at the edge, there's very minimal work that they have to do. There's always going to be some issues here and there. The training that has to occur is really when things don't go right. But from a installing, operating, maintaining, we want to make that as scripted, as automated as possible. And then we'll work the eaches as they happen. But again, the goal would be to move all that complexity up to the higher echelons and manage via a capability such as UNO that we're targeting beginning in 24.
And Colonel Paul, down to our last 5 minutes here, I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about all the work that I know that you're having to do to rationalize applications to get them cloud native or at least cloud tolerant. Talk about some of the challenge that you got involved there and some of the work that you're doing to make all of the applications that you have compatible with cloud.
We are doing a lot in the software space. There are about 24 mission command applications across not only my organization, but really across the Army, many of which were developed and 5, 10, in some cases 25 years ago, without cloud in mind, right? These are not cloud native they're not optimized to run in a cloud environment, that hyperscale environment, that CPCE.com, aFatids.com like environment. And so what we're doing now is we're prioritizing investment to be able to, rewire, refactor those applications in a way that they could be truly cloud native, or at least less clunky in a cloud environment. So units like I-Core can operate in that sort of hybrid environment to enable what they need to do from an operational perspective, from a distributed command and control perspective. So we're prioritizing the command post computing environment. We're investing in that. We're doing some pilots. We're working with U.S.A and I-Core, and then we're also working with TRADOC on a training cloud pilot to put CPC in the cloud and have different training centers actually collaborate in a training exercise when they're geographically dispersed to try to replicate that distributed command and control in a training environment. Also on the fire side, so aFatids, which is the Army's primary, digital firing system application, I should say, as well as JDOCS, which is our targeting application that lives at the brigade division level and above. So there's a lot of work that's being done in that space. We're kind of building the plane as we're flying it, as we're updating the software and making it more cloud native. We're trying to get it out into the field as part of exercises or pilots to get reps and sets. So it's a journey. It's not, reform. This transformation is not going to happen overnight, but we have a roadmap, and I'm optimistic that we'll be able to get to our end state. So that's how we're trying to get out of technical debt within our organization. We just offer another example of data to enable decisions and sort of this digital transformation that we've been talking about. So when we were over in U.S.A a couple of weeks ago, we work with the users to generate user stories to understand their pain points. What are their capability gaps? What we learned in sort of the logistics space, that there are entire organizations and staff sections that spend hours, if not days, building PowerPoint charts. What we're doing, really our first main effort over the next couple of weeks is to try to digitize that capability. So instead of 58 PowerPoint charts, we're going to provide 2 visualization layers on CPCE, their common operating picture, with a lot of data integration behind it. So they can present the same information on their map without having to do any of the manual upfront work. And because we have that persistent access to all of those authoritative data sources, that those layers update in real time. So we're going to save hundreds of hours worth of work, and we're going to enable that commander to be able to understand his battle space better, to be able to see himself better, without requiring the staff to do a whole bunch of unnecessary work.
There is so much we could talk about still, but we are unfortunately going to have to leave it there for time. I really want to thank our guests, Colonel Liz Casely, the CIO G6 for the Army's First Corps, Colonel Matt Paul, Project Manager for Mission Command, and Colonel Shane Taylor, Project Manager for Tactical Networks, both with PEO C3T. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to the 2023 DOD Cloud Exchange. This has been our Army Tactical Panel. More coming up. We're going to toss it back to the studio right now, and Alex.